and I'm the sort of go-between, so I oversee this program here. My first thank goes to Nicholas Cockrell here at the Hinckley Institute, who is the Managing Director of Community Engagement at Hinckley, and he has been the one who has put it together so meticulously. We thank him so much. We're also very honored to have the Provost of Westminster College, Debbie Messerby, here with us, and we are still expecting to see President Beth Dobkin of Westminster College. She will be arriving rather soon. And also, we'll be seeing Professor Michael Popovich from the Philosophy Department at Westminster College, who is also the director of the Tanner McMillan Lecture Series. And until they get here, we'll get started here. I would like to, in fact, introduce our two very distinguished speakers. The first speaker is going to be Professor Lionel McPherson of Tufts University. He's in the philosophy department there, and he received his PhD from Harvard and his BA from Princeton. And his research interests include normativity, the basis and extent of obligations, war and terrorism, and race. All these very extremely important topic and current topics, and he is the big name in all these things all over the country. And his book, that's his forthcoming book, is titled The Afterlife of Race, an Informed Philosophical Search, and it's forthcoming this fall from Oxford University Press. And just one quick personal note, it was my big honor to have Professor McPherson, Lionel, as we call him, with us at the panel in the American Philosophical Association Pacific Division quite a while ago, and he was discussing my book that got out from Cambridge University Press on war and peace, and the panel was on that book, and he was a speaker. It was my great honor to meet him at that time quite a while ago. And our second speaker is Professor Erin Kelly, who is currently the Charles Stebbins Fairchild Visiting Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, and she's also a professor of philosophy at Tufts University. Her specialization happens to be, in fact, quite a few, just I mentioned only a few of them, in philosophy of law and moral and political philosophy. And she is the author of this very important and famous book, The Limits of Blame, Rethinking Punishment and Responsibility, published from Harvard University Press in 2018. And in 2022, just very recently, she won the Pulitzer Prize in biography for a memoir she co-authored with artist Winfred Rembert. That memoir is titled Chasing Me to My Grave, an artist memoir of the Jim Crow South. I would like to show you that book. Can you get that book? Yeah. And here is this book. Here is that famous book, and got the Pulitzer Prize and co-authored by our speaker here, Professor Erin Kelly. And just a personal note here too, I had the great honor of collaborating with Professor Kelly, Erin, as we call her, on two book projects that eventually came out published from Cambridge University Press. So we have been together on projects for quite a few years, for a long time rather, okay? And so before they get started, we have with us Professor Michael Popovich. He's in the philosophy department there at Westminster College, as you mentioned, and he's the director of the Tanner McMillan Lecture Series. He is going to say a few words on behalf of the lecture series, and then we'll get started with our two speakers. Thank you so much. Michael?
Thank you, Dean. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this will be the 30th lecture in the lecture series that began in 1989. We've had a few interruptions because of the pandemic and another glitch, but this is the 30th lecture. I'm pleased to welcome Lionel McPherson and Aaron Kelly for that purpose. And hopefully we will enjoy the afternoon and the discussion. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you, Michael. So the topic of today's forum is, of course, as we all know, caste, not race, and the politics of blame. The first close to an hour, the two speakers will be speaking, followed by Q&A from the audience for about roughly half an hour. Then we'll have, as Nick mentioned earlier, a nice reception just outside at the fire. So I will invite our speaker, Professor McPherson.
Do you want your book back? Okay, can I be heard now? Good. All right, so first I want to thank the University of Utah and Westminster College and Michael and Dean for inviting Aaron and I. It's an honor to be invited. We haven't done a joint lecture before, ever. And I don't think we know exactly what we're going to be doing. I don't even know exactly what I'll be doing, but I'm about to find out, as are you. I'd also like to thank Dean and Donna just for being such wonderful and gracious hosts personally. So thank you very much. We really enjoyed seeing Salt Lake and going up and seeing Park City and, what is it, Deer Valley? Yeah, and we saw deer in Deer Valley as well, and a lot of snow. So, all right, I have to keep it tight. So I have until the most 12:45. Okay. So let me start with a tale of two anecdotes. And I'm not gonna use the word, I'll just talk about the N word, but it's important to keep in mind the word was actually used in print. I wouldn't mind using it, but I'm gonna be polite and gentle to the audience, so I'll just use the N-word convention instead, even though Los Angeles Times and the New Yorker printed the word back in the day, not so long ago. So, a tale of two anecdotes. First anecdote, Kofi Annan, he went on to become the first African Secretary General of the UN from Ghana, and a very distinguished diplomat. Secretary of the UN, late 90s, early 2000s, but he was an exchange student at Macalester College, I think that's in St. Paul, Minnesota, in the early 60s. And he went on a little road trip to the Jim Crow South, and he needed to get his hair cut, and so he stopped at a barber, and the barber said, pretty much no N-words allowed. And young Kofi Annan said, I'm not an N-word, I'm an African. And the barber said, well then, sit down, and cut his hair. And that was told by a white journalist friend of his, and you can find that anecdote in the New Yorker in a piece, I think by Philip Gurovich in early 2000, late 90s. So that's the first anecdote. I'm not an N-word, I'm an African. Second anecdote, about 30 years later, Mayor David Dinkins, first what people would call, and we'll get into why this needs to be made clear later, but first so-called black mayor of New York City, I think from 90 to 93, and this was printed in the Los Angeles Times, and he told this story, and the story goes like this, that, what do you call a white man with $1 million? He says, you call him a millionaire. What do you call a black man with $1 million? You call him an N-word with $1 million. So that's, do people get it? Yeah. So, and David Dinkins, I take it, wasn't just black in some general global sense, but more specifically, and this is a major theme of what I'm talking about today, and what I talk about certainly for most of my book, but certainly the first half, he was a descendant of American slavery, or more clearly, an Africa-identified descendant of American slavery. So when he was talking about, when Kofi Annan was talking about N-words, they're talking about that subset or subgroup of what I call Africa-identified people, namely Africa-identified descendants of American slavery. And I think you can see, I could spell out who these people are. I'm even prepared to call such people Black. I would use the convention with the uppercase B, not as an honorific, a vague honorific, or some mysterious reason to capitalize the B and not also the W, but as something akin to a more familiar language, an ethnic designation. Black Americans, capital B, as in descendants of American slavery. The Black refers to being Africa identified. And I say Africa identified because things get complicated very quickly. Most Black Americans, that is capital B, descendants of American slavery, have substantial non-African ancestry. So I think it's about 25%. And that comes through basically British paternity during American slavery as a result of coerced reproduction, basically, or coerced sex leading to childbirth. So, right, I don't need to be involved with any kind of complicated, mysterious story about race to use this figurative color description and to make it clear that I'm not talking in a global sense about Blacks or racial Blacks or anything like that, but more specifically, especially in the context of the United States, Black Americans, capital B, as descendants of American slavery, where the B, lowercase or capital, just means roughly Africa identified. If I talk about white, if it's uppercase, it would be like an ethnic designation for white Americans. Lowercase would just be Europe identified people generally. That's all I mean. I can spell that out. I don't need to get involved in any kind of extended inquiry about the nature of race. Okay, and I think I just showed pretty quickly, it's not actually that mind-boggling to be specific about who we're talking about without making any kind of appeal to race, and I'll return to that. So that was all by way of prelude. So you see how I can run out of time pretty quickly. So that's prelude. Okay, so I'll just kind of hew to very brief prepared remarks, and then just go through a few points that I think make it clear. I think I can make it clear why it makes a lot more sense, at least for those who are thinking about history and reparative justice, makes a lot more sense to think in terms of American caste, not in terms of race. So, as Dean pointed out, I have this book that's going to be forthcoming from Oxford University Press in the fall, The Afterlife of Race, an Informed Philosophical Search. And in that book, I argue that the perpetual, stigmatized, disadvantaged, largely wealthless condition of Black America, capital B Black America, is best understood as a caste phenomenon. Caste analysis of American color consciousness calls attention to the intergenerational nature and national specificity of the Black American, capital B Black American situation, which is rooted in slavery, inherited slavery, and in forced segregation. Forced segregation, Jim Crow. I like to say enforced segregation because sometimes people are confused about what Jim Crow was. It wasn't just a matter of not being able to use a water fountain or bathroom. It was a comprehensive system of domination. And so, I like to say, enforced segregation or American apartheid. Okay, so that's, I think, caste gets us closer to thinking in terms of inherited slavery, enforced segregation, and their legacies. Race analysis, by contrast, traffics in flat blackness, as it were. I don't think I came up with that phrase, but flat blackness basically would turn Africa-identified descendants of American slavery from a distinctive national people, which I think they and we, since I'm among them, clearly are, national people, neither native nor immigrant, into a vague, racially lowercase, so-called Black people, where it's not really clear exactly what that's supposed to mean. It was never supposed to be clear, actually, what that's supposed to mean. In the original use, in the context of what became the United States, Black was just a shorthand designation for what I call Africa-identified persons, and race didn't even show up on the census in any form until 1900, and even then it was part of a color or race category. And race, what was supposed to be the race category, didn't show up on the US Census alone until 1950. And if you look, and you can see all this for yourself, I highly recommend that you go back and look at US Census forms because they basically make the argument for me. And I discovered this pretty late. The census tells the tale. So, for example, what you will find, I think the first census, 1790, two main categories were free white. It's not just white, it was free white. And then the other category was slaves. And there was a third category, other free people. That time it would have been Native Americans. There wasn't even a color designation for the slaves caste. So I think it's pretty clear when you look from the start what was really at stake. It was inherited slavery. It was not some mysterious, elusive race thing, as I call it. I came up with talking in terms of the quote unquote race thing, because what I found in writing is it was very hard even to capture, to allude to this thing, and my point is it's not even clear what this thing is supposed to be, except we're talking about so-called blacks, lowercase b, Africa-identified persons who have African ancestry, generally visible. But as I said, if you look at the census, they don't make any mention of the so-called race or color at all, originally, of the slave caste. As I would put it, they're called slaves. That was foundational. Free white category, or as I put it, white freedom. In the slaves category, just turned out all the slaves were originally of African descent, and then over time became what I would call an Afro-Anglo hybrid people, right? We're not an African people, and that's exactly part of what some of these vague categories like black or race or Negro kind of disguising this kind of black specificity. Okay, so what I call race intrigue principally functions as a distraction, namely from the subjugation, exploitation, and non-repair of the historical American slaves caste by misdirecting focus to some global or general anti-black racism phenomenon, which I think is pretty clear is of far lesser importance. So think about it like this, right? What's really going on foundationally in the United States, well, most foundationally, of course, you have settler colonialism, native depopulation. I think that's about at the rate of 90%. 90% of the native population is wiped out in the settler colonial operation. There was never any investment in a race story there. That was pretty much just a conquest story. You got Christians, you got native barbarians, but there was never really, and there's never really been any very clear and stable race story applied to Native Americans because none was necessary. Moreover, now let's switch from the settler colonialism, native depopulation situation to the slavery situation. So as everybody knows by now, because of the 1619 Project, American slavery basically begins in 1619. But it took a little bit longer for sort of the fundamental details of that situation to be worked out, namely the 1662, basically inherited slavery law in Virginia, and I might be able to get back to this. That appealed to the free or enslaved status of the mother, and that was supposed to be the basis, and that was the legal basis then for enslaving basically children born to Africa-identified slave women with white British fathers, biological fathers, right? So then there's a question, what do you do with them? What do you do with this hybrid offspring? Well, the law resolved this. They were to be enslaved. And they were to be enslaved in perpetuity based on the so-called condition of the mother, which is not based on any sort of race theory, right? It was based, I guess it was reappropriated from English livestock law. Okay, so 1662, inherited slavery law. Race the idea of continental races didn't even come into being until Francois Bernier, French traveler and physician, and that's 1684. So I'm just saying, if you just look at the dates, there was no appeal to a race thing. In the Virginia inherited slavery law, there was mention of Negro, but Negro was just a term basically adapted from Spanish and Portuguese, referring to dark-skinned African. It was not a race thing. The continental race idea doesn't come into existence until 1684. And even then, it came into existence not for any sort of nefarious or political purpose, but basically just taxonomic. This French guy was sailing around. He noticed there were patterns to how people looked depending on what continent they were from. And he said, oh, I think I have a new way of dividing up the world. But he wasn't trying to divide it up in terms of any kind of hierarchy, maybe a bit of an aesthetic hierarchy, but other than that, it didn't really have any political purpose. It was more, let's call it strictly taxonomic. Okay, so, but that, so to speak, invention of content, and this, let me be clear. I'm talking about race, talking about the idea of continental races, right? Because however that story is supposed to go in identifying who's the membership of these continental races, but the term race had been used before that, right? And people will point that out, oh, it goes to pre-modern and even ancient times. Yes, that's true, but it's not all, it's even less clear what that's, there's a Jewish race, there's a Hamitic, then there's too many races of all kinds. It just means, it seems in the general sense, pre-modern sense, of people that are supposed to be marked out by some sort of essential difference. Okay, but in the modern or modern context, this idea of race refers more specifically to, or is supposed to refer more specifically to continental races. So you have the formation of inherited slavery, an inherited slavery institution beginning in 1662. You don't even have the idea of continental races until 1684. It's pretty clear that race, and this sort of is getting closer here, that race was never crucial, even particularly important in, well, we'll see, it's even outrageous to say, in providing some sort of justification for the idea or for the practice of inherited slavery. Had nothing to do with it. There was no appeal to race whatsoever. Okay, and I think this is where I think thinking in terms of caste, not race, becomes particularly helpful, because you might say, well, that seems incredible, your claim seems incredible, how could that be? We are told that race and racism have had all these awful effects and major contributors to injustice and are used in what were supposed to be justifications for slavery and colonialism and apartheid. I'm like, no, that's not true. With all due respect to the people that I engage and criticize, it's not true. And you can see it's not true, for example, just by looking at the census forms. You can see that it's not true by looking at when American inherited slavery begins, what the rationale for that was. Continental races hadn't even been did not even exist as an idea yet. It wasn't about that. It was just about basically maintaining and reproducing a slaves caste. And it just turns out that the slaves were very reliably indicated by visible African ancestry, because they were brought from not Africa. It's true they were from Africa, but more specifically from basically a Western chunk. Senegal, Gambia, Nigeria, Benin, some in the Congo, that was it. And Africa, contrary to what you see on most maps, is huge. It's not, as Hegel thought, compact. It's huge. So the American slaves come from this Western chunk over here. You got all this other Africa over here, just to say, right? Obama's father came from the other side, way over here. So you go, in what sense is he black? Well, he's black in the sense that he has visible African ancestry, obviously. His mother was white, just means Europe identified on the basis of, I got clear, beyond majority, almost entirely, European ancestry. But the sense in which, like, for example, Obama would be black and black Americans would be black is very different. Come from different places on the continent, different background family histories, different kinds of things involved, and those things matter. And you can see that they matter, and that's why I started with those two anecdotes, Look at especially Kofi Annan's anecdote. Clear distinction in his mind between inwards, and not just in his mind, but also in people, white Americans working in the Jim Crow South, in their mind as well. They recognize the distinction between inwards and Africans, blacks, whatever. It was not about Africanness as such. It wasn't about blacks as such. It was specifically about inwards, and that is a distinctively American phenomenon, referring roughly to, and I'm citing right now, the sociologist David Pilgrim, who put together this amazing Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia, and you can, if you dare, you can see this. They have a great virtual site, and so you can see all these exhibits, and he describes N-words as basically lazy, dirty, worthless parasites, even though, of course, they built all this stuff. That's what it refers to in parasites, namely as American slaves, not as blacks, not as Africans, not as people who have one drop African ancestry, none of that, right? So I'm basically saying we got to, if you focus on what this sort of American color consciousness was foundationally about, it was basically about a free white group or free white caste and a slaves caste. It just turns out slaves were identified with Africa, even though they become, for obvious reasons, pretty soon an Afro-Anglo hybrid people. And again, it wasn't that so-called race played any role in, so to speak, justifying slavery. I can explain this another way as well, namely this. What would it mean to think about some sort of characteristic justifying inherited slavery? And I think if you think about it for a few moments, you go, hold on a second, there could be no such thing, right? So just like there could be no such thing, say, about Jews that would factor into any so-called justification or possible not unhinged sort of justification or story for the Holocaust. There's no reason to look at anything about the nature of Jews. You don't need to have any kind of exotic theories about, you might have some exotic theory about anti-Semitism, but even then you'll realize nothing you're going to find out about anti-Semitism is going to make sense of how there could be a genocide with regard to this, call it social identity characteristic, because there could be no such thing. No such story could possibly make sense. We know this in advance because we know what's involved in the activity. There's no remotely serious way to get a reasonable rationale for genocide. Certainly not by the 20th century. We're not going back to Viking times. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie The Northman, but we're not going back to that, right? We're talking about more recent modern times. And similarly, there's nothing you're gonna find out, no matter what kind of investigation you do about race or the nature of Negroes or American Negroes or racism in the heart or in the structure of this, that, and the other. None of that is really gonna help you understand, or it's worse than that, it's gonna actually get in the way of understanding the more basic reality of what this American color consciousness was about, which was foundationally this distinction between free Europeans, or Europe-identified people, originally British, but they had, they already were anticipating a kind of pan-European conception of whiteness. On the one hand, there was that, and on the other hand, you had this slaves caste. So what do I mean by caste? You might say, it's like, okay, the story you're telling, we get it, but what's this caste thing? And I don't think there's anything complicated about the caste idea. It's just basically a stable, fixed, rigid, social, I would say stark social status hierarchy. And I think what's important to point out here is it's fixed and rigid because it is socially heritable. It has nothing to do with some sort of strange stories about how you could inherit by virtue of really any kind of remotely plausible characteristic. You could inherit slave status because of that thing. It's socially heritable. Socially heritable in this case of what became the United States, by virtue of the stigma, profound stigma attached to being enslaved. So that's what it's about. And it just turns out that people in this context who were enslaved were pretty, for the most part, readily identifiable on account of having visible African ancestry. So in short, caste is basically just referring to this stark social status hierarchy, fixed and rigid, stable over time. It's an inherited kind of social status. It has nothing to do with any kind of natural characteristic or general belief in some sort of natural characteristic, or people being mean, or people not understanding something about the nature of Negroes or race itself, or it had nothing to do with that. It's a much more straightforward story. And I think how many time is, I have 5 minutes, good. So I gotta do this. So I just wanna make clear in summary about the idea of justification. So I absolutely resist, and I think it's not only absurd, but I think if you think about it a little bit, to think it becomes even kind of offensive to believe that something about race or racism has been playing a major role in understanding what I call foundational American color consciousness. It was just slavery, inherited slavery. That's it. There could be no justification for such an atrocious institution. There's no reason to look out and get into all sorts of exotic theories, whether thinking about race or racism. You don't need to do that. In fact, it's better not to do that. That leads us away from thinking about what was really going on with regard to the institution of American slavery. So no justification. What there is instead, as I put it, is in race ideology rhetoric, right, which contributes to kind of obscuring and mystifying and offering pretenses to something that's supposed to be in the realm of a justification, but I think is so absurd it doesn't even deserve the description, characterization as a moral rationalization, right? So I call them pseudo-rationalizations because there's nothing remotely there. Just like if you're looking for a moral rationalization for genocide, what are you going to come up with? We already know in advance, nothing, because there could be no such thing. And I take it, rationalizations were supposed to be anchored in some sort of reality, right? It's just kind of an alternative, somewhat self-deceptive story. But there is no alternative reality, I think, in the slavery case, and also in the colonialism, especially settler colonialism case, because there could be no such thing. So I think if you're thinking, well, okay, what's supposed to be the deep moral justification or rationalization for slavery, or what were they thinking? I think, well, there was no deep moral justification or rationalization. There was none at all, in fact, because there couldn't be, and it wasn't necessarily tied to some race thing. It's just tied to outsider status, right? So these aren't our people. We can go and grab them, buy them, whatever, use them for our purposes. So I want to say, ultimately, all this race and racism inquiry has really been, or certainly has the effect of clouding, disguising, obscuring, I think, what's fundamentally going on, which is basically various kinds of schemes in different places. It's not only about American slavery, but of subjugation, exploitation, and non-repair. That's what it's about. And I think you can get that much more clearly by thinking in terms of caste, which focuses on a structure and a structure of a certain kind of domination, and how that perpetuates itself, not by going down all sorts of rabbit holes about racism and race and all the things that they do. Do I have a couple minutes? Let me see. Okay, so I will close with a sort of another somewhat anecdote, and I gotta do it. I did this when I spoke at the University of Virginia a couple of years. I had to speak on Jefferson. But I was walking around, and we were driving, and I said, Stephen Douglas, why? These Douglas, you all know that Douglas, who is this guy, and why is he here? Well, I'll tell you who he was, and I'll just read. You can hear for yourself who he was. And going, maybe, y'all might want to think about, I don't know. I'm not even big on changing names, but I'm just going to tell you what he said. 1858, famed Lincoln-Douglas debate during their campaign for U.S. Senator from Illinois. Douglas said, I'm opposed to Negro citizenship in any and every form. I believe this government was made on the white basis. I believe it was made for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever. And I'm in favor of confining citizenship to white men. What does he mean by white? You think racial? No, he's about to explain it. Men of European birth and descent. Okay, so that was the popular sovereignty side of the famed Lincoln-Douglas debate. And I will close now with what Lincoln said. And I think what you will see is They're both affirming the American caste system, nothing approximating social equality ever for descendants of American slavery, okay? Lincoln just didn't think that slavery was going to be feasible going forward. Here's what he said, and then I will stop and turn it over to Aaron. I will say then that I am not, nor have I ever been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. I'll stop reading that quote there and close with this. What you find when you look at where there's supposed to be these racial justifications is they got nothing to say. Jefferson had nothing to say. Lincoln had nothing to say. All Lincoln says is something about the physical differences between the two races. Obviously, that doesn't even pretend to be some sort of justification or rationalization for slavery or for the subsequent version of this caste system and forced segregation, right? So when you actually look at what they said, that we're told is supposed to be part of a justification or rationalization, they really don't even offer one. Difference of skin color, Jefferson makes the same move. They got nothing. So I think you can see then that they didn't even take this race and racism idea that seriously, given the role that many people think it's supposed to be playing, which is factoring to some sort of explanation, moral explanation or some kind as to how this atrocious institution could have persisted for so long, and then a close variant of that with enforced segregation. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, good. Thank you. It's a great honor to be here delivering the Tanner McMurrin lecture. And I'd like to echo Lionel's thanks to our generous hosts. Thank you all for coming to hear what we have to say. In the United States, the practice of criminal law enforcement expresses and confers, I'm going to argue, a stigma on Black Americans. The politics of blame, as we might call it, merges distinctions between act, person, and group. And I want to describe how the politics of blame operates in the American criminal justice system and why we should be concerned about it. And then I want to touch briefly on the idea of restorative justice as an alternative, non-punitive response to crime that I think is worth considering. So let's start with the internal logic of the criminal justice system. The lens through which the criminal justice system presents the problem of crime and its remedies is one of personal responsibility. Holding a defendant individually responsible involves abstracting from his or her social situation, including the effects on that person's life of social and institutional injustice. Social and institutional causes of crime are displaced by the criminal law's individualistic perspective. So the question taken up by a criminal court is this: did this defendant commit a crime? The crime, say, of robbery or an assault, whatever it is the person's charged with, did this person do that act? That's the question before the law. So why the defendant chose to act as he did is of little interest, if it's considered at all. So criminal courts are mostly uninterested in motives and reasoning behind a criminal choice or how to make sense of a defendant's criminal choice in view of her personal history or life situation. These are contextual, interesting, important considerations that don't come into the legal process. So the focus of the legal proceeding is whether the criminal act took place, whether the accused did it. So the responsibility inquiry, we might say, is narrowly act-focused. Personal meaning, however, is ascribed to findings of criminal guilt. And in our current social and political climate, this happens in a way that reflects retributive ideas about justice. Retributive theories of justice are organized around the idea that the purpose of the criminal justice system is to give criminal offenders the punishment they deserve. So what criminal wrongdoers deserve, according to retributive theories, is to be punished in proportion to their culpable wrongdoing. So retributivists believe that justice demands the hard treatment of criminal wrongdoers. Punishment is retribution for wrongdoing. So this is a popular idea, not only among philosophers and criminal law theorists, but also the public. I think it's probably a familiar idea to you. And I think the American criminal justice system encourages this way of thinking, this retributive way of thinking about justice, by purporting to align legal criteria of guilt with moral criteria of blameworthiness. So the elements of crime, including the importance of a mental state element of crime, underscore this orientation and alleged alignment. So the mental state element of a crime concerns whether the defendant committed a crime intentionally or recklessly, say, or if we use the terms of the common law, with malice or a depraved heart. These are familiar terms within criminal law. A criminal mental state is typically understood as significant for what it reveals or is alleged to reveal about the person's will, character, and dispositions. So in this way, criminal law is licensing an inference that the criminally guilty are morally blameworthy. But I would argue that many incarcerated people, for example, people who are mentally ill or desperately poor, or people who have been deprived of reasonable opportunities to lead a decent law-abiding life, may not be blameworthy or as blameworthy for their criminal acts, even when they're criminally guilty. So I think we exaggerate the moral meaning of criminal guilt, and that this is easy to do since morally mitigating factors, including mental illness, hardships of poverty or oppression, are not relevant to the determination of criminal guilt, and so they're not acknowledged. They're not part of the conversation. So the exaggeration and sometimes outright distortion of the moral meaning, as I'm calling it, of criminal guilt is a kind of moralism about criminal justice. So in my book, The Limits of Blame, Rethinking Punishment and Responsibility, I criticize the moralistic practice of assigning blame through the criminal justice system. And I argue that the American attachment to moral blame and punishment has gone beyond a pragmatic need for protection from crime or a moral need to repudiate harmful or even heinous acts. It represents a kind of moralistic desire for retribution that's come to normalize excessive punishment. And it's no exaggeration to say that the punitiveness of the American criminal justice system is extreme. The United States has the most punitive system in the whole world. So here's a chart of international rates of incarceration per 100,000 people. There we are, United States, the world leader, 670 people per 100,000 people, leading the world, which I don't think is something to be proud of. We've got here, behind the United States, Rwanda, significantly lower incarceration rates, still very high. This is a country that had a genocide, and their criminal justice system was overwhelmed by people who committed mass murder. And then you can go down their list. Russia, not exactly democratic country, problems of organized crime, all kinds of problems, Brazil, Argentina, Spain, and so on. And the US is sticking way out there in front. And here's a chart of the changes over time in the American incarceration rate. You can see a spike starting kind of in the mid-1970s and accelerating over the next 4 decades, to a peak. Our incarceration rate came down a little bit under the pandemic, but still I think this just shows state and federal prison population, about 1.6 million. If you add in people who are confined in jails, you have about 2 million people. Okay, so let me be clear about something I'm saying, kind of an aspect of my thesis here. I don't think that a morally blaming orientation, even a moralistic one, is responsible for the problem of mass incarceration. To understand why the American criminal justice system is so punitive, we have to look to factors that extend beyond common moral attitudes toward criminal lawbreakers as such. We should consider the legacy of American slavery and the extreme income and wealth inequality that it comprises, together with such factors as excessive fear of crime, lack of mental health care, decaying inner city schools, racial segregation, joblessness, and other social problems. So the dynamics of blame that concern me intersect with those of racial and socioeconomic injustice, but I wouldn't say that the popularity of the retributive sentiments is the driving force behind over-incarceration. However, I believe that the idea of retributive justice, and more generally our society's investment in morally blaming and condemning criminal lawbreakers, serves to rationalize the practice of punishment in a way that decreases empathy for people who are caught up in the criminal justice system. And it does this by maintaining that people who are guilty of crime deserve to be hurt and cast out. The practice of blaming criminal offenders normalizes punishment, and it does so even when punishment is excessive, as it is in the American criminal justice system. So in my brief time, my point is going to be that background injustice, specifically, to use the language McPherson has offered us, the American racial caste system, unsettles the meaning of individual criminal responsibility, creating a tension for criminal law. So the law is caught between an ethical mode of individual accountability on the one hand, and group-focused measures of social control on the other. And the tension between these modes raises a serious challenge for familiar ways of thinking about criminal justice. So let's start with the familiar idea of retributive justice, which I've described as the idea that justice requires that criminal wrongdoers get the punishment they deserve. The retributive philosophy views moral desert as a function of wrongdoing, which is what the criminal offender has done, the act, and culpability, something about the person that reflects that person's mental state, dispositions, will, attitudes, and so on. So this philosophy of criminal justice is grounded in an understanding of responsibility that follows a paradigm of a person who's freely chosen to do wrong and whose wrongdoing demonstrates a problem with that person's will or character. So as I've already suggested, a paradigm of individual accountability is embedded in the law itself. It's fundamental. That's what's being investigated. But individually focused blame is hard to reconcile with something we know, which is that the causes of both crime and punishment are social as much as individual. In fact, both crime and punishment have many causes, and these causes extend well beyond individual exercises of free will. Causes of crime are found not only in criminal agency, that is, the criminal choices that individual persons make and could have refrained from making, but also in the circumstances that help to explain the choices that people make. So criminologists ask why crime rates are higher in certain neighborhoods or among a certain segment of the population, defined, for example, by income level, race, age, educational attainment, and other possible factors. And in that investigation, individual choice is an uninteresting background condition against which the causal relevance of these factors is explored. And social scientists have found that criminal choices are influenced by poverty, racial discrimination, racial segregation, educational deprivation, lack of adult supervision, intergenerational trauma, weak community support, and joblessness, among other factors. So despite the many causes of crime that are connected in the way they are with social inequality, moral blame is directed at people as individuals who are convicted of crime. So blame involves an inference from act to person, and that's what I'm saying is going on when we blame somebody. And basically, the idea is that blame says something about the person based on that person's action. So blame says it's not only the act, but the person who is bad. That's the inference. Now there's more to the story. Blame is an inference from criminal conviction that's rationalized by the point of punishment, conceived, I'm arguing, as the task of giving blameworthy wrongdoers the punishment they deserve. So inferring moral blameworthiness from criminal guilt is justified by the point of punishment. If the agent is punishable, then that person is blameworthy, or so the logic of the rationale for the system goes. So now let's color this picture. As McPherson has emphasized, American society is a society in which awareness of color-coded caste identity is acute. This awareness is reinforced by the practice of criminal law enforcement. Ours is a system of selective accountability. Race and socioeconomic status influence who attracts law enforcement, as well as who among the guilty gets punished and how much. Through the discretion offered to law enforcement in surveillance, investigation, arrest, prosecution, and punishment, criminal justice operates in a mode of social control with demographic markers. So here's some of what we know. Law enforcement officials more aggressively police black neighborhoods. And this may not be surprising since poor inner-city neighborhoods have higher violent crime rates. Yet aggressive policing extends well beyond a response to serious crimes and may even ignore them. The popular broken windows policing policy focuses on low-level crimes, on the theory that crimes like public drunkenness, loitering, and vandalism attract other more serious crimes. That's the theory, the broken windows theory. Broken windows policing is more common in neighborhoods that have higher proportions of Black and Latino residents, resulting in more police encounters and more opportunities for arrest. 75 to 80% of arrests overall are for misdemeanors. In 2020, researchers at John Jay College published a longitudinal study on racial disparities in misdemeanor arrests. They analyzed data collected from governmental agencies from the early 2000s to the late 2010s in 7 US cities. They found an approximately 3 to 7 times higher rate of arrest for Black suspects in comparison with white suspects for misdemeanor offenses. The researchers correlated this rate with concentrated policing in Black neighborhoods, right? Broken windows policing. And it's not surprising that you would get that result, since it stands to reason that where you focus your policing efforts is where you're likely to make more arrests. But more surprising, and contrary to the theory of broken windows, is that researchers found no correlation between higher misdemeanor arrest rates and lower violent crime rates, challenging the theory. Data indicates that police are more likely to stop Black drivers as well as Black pedestrians. A police accountability task force in Chicago found that police stopped and searched Black and Latino drivers 4 times more than they searched white drivers, and also that they found contraband twice as often on white drivers compared to Black and Latino drivers. Other studies controlling for the seriousness of offenses and a suspect's prior criminal record have documented higher arrest rates for Black suspects in general. We also know that prosecutors more aggressively charge Black suspects For instance, data from 2016 indicates that despite comparable levels of drug use, Black defendants were arrested, prosecuted, convicted, and sentenced at significantly higher rates on drug charges. Here's a representation of it from one source, according to which you could see that Black people make up 13% of the population in the United States. They comprise 15% of drug users, 18 years of age or older, yet they comprise 27% of the number of people arrested for drug possession and distribution, 31% of those sentenced by state for drug-related crimes, and 38% of those sentenced federally on drug charges. And we can go on. Black defendants are more likely to be deprived of adequate legal representation because they're disproportionately poor. This leads to higher conviction rates. There's also evidence of jury bias and evidence that Black defendants are more harshly sentenced across all types of crimes, including capital offenses. A 2015 study correlating sentences with the defendant's skin tone found that darker-skinned men facing first-time felony convictions received, on average, sentences that were 400 days longer than their white counterparts, 200 days longer than Black men with medium skin tones, and 27 days longer than Black men with light skin tone. So these practices, and this is my main point, these practices send a message. In our criminal law culture of blame, they convey judgments of increased blameworthiness. So in the language of criminal law, they suggest the defendant's greater depravity and malice, or in more modern language, they suggest the defendant is more dangerous and poses a graver threat to the public. So the result is that criminal conviction confers a harsher stigma on defendants who are members of the color-coded bottom caste. And not only that, criminal conviction casts stigma on members of the bottom caste group in general. So in other words, the stigma of criminalization extends beyond the individual to the group as a whole. Why? Because it's the defendant's caste identity rather than his criminal conduct that's attracting more punitive attitudes and responses. And this is confirmed by studies showing that people who associate crime with racial minorities have more punitive attitudes. Even more specifically, as indicated by the skin tone study that I just mentioned to you, it's a defendant's blackness that attracts more punitive responses. So we have a criminal justice system that permits the targeted confinement and condemnation of a segment of the population that has been most excluded from the rights and opportunities of full democratic membership and is least likely to be integrated into the social order under the rule of law. The result is that incarceration is an expected life event for a certain segment of the population. Young, uneducated Black men who live in disadvantaged neighborhoods. And here's a chart of the disparities in the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment across different racial / ethnic groups in the United States. You can see the highest rate here is for Black men who can expect to be incarcerated at a rate of 1 in 3. So we have two competing levels of description for criminal law. On the one hand, criminal law has an inner logic of individual accountability. Individual actors are liable for how they choose to act. On the other hand, criminal law displays a group-focused social control function. The criminal law's attention is trained on certain socially salient groups, namely the most seriously disadvantaged. And to that extent, the social control function of criminal law is rooted in a caste hierarchy according to which the society bears collective responsibility. We have collective responsibility for what I'm calling background justice. But the logic of accountability in criminal law leaves no formal institutional way to acknowledge this. In fact, it's designed not to. The ethical grammar of criminal law, if you will, contains no account of social injustice. Attention to social and institutional causes of criminalization and crime, thus, is at odds with the traditional individualized understanding of accountability in the law. And this presents a problem for thinking about criminal justice. Under socially unjust circumstances, criminal choices don't represent free choices made under a set of decent alternatives, and this complicates the ethical evaluation of those choices. Sometimes criminal choices are clearly bad choices, even under unjust circumstances. Sometimes they're poor choices that people understandably make under circumstances of, for example, poverty, alienation, and despair. Sometimes they represent relatively good choices in relation to serious human need, and sometimes they are arguably legitimate acts of protest against unjust circumstances themselves. But even when they're bad choices, we don't need to think about them retributively, and I think we have reasons not to. Seeking retributive justice aggravates the tension between individual responsibility and background injustice that I've been talking about. And it's that tension that lies at the heart of our fraught criminal justice system. I think that gives us reasons to reject it as an ethical paradigm for thinking about crime and punishment. Still, I don't deny that some crimes represent wrongs, sometimes serious wrongs. So we have a question about what to do. So what I want to do now, just for a few minutes, is to sketch out an alternative concept of accountability that's rooted in the idea of restorative justice. So restorative justice is the idea that justice requires redress rather than retribution. This alternative picture does not directly address the problem of background injustice, but it does indirectly call attention to it, and it provides an alternative to a retributive mode of thinking about crime and punishment. So let me just say a few things about restorative justice. Restorative justice is an interpersonal reckoning with wrongdoing between two parties, a responsible party and a victim. So as it's currently practiced in the United States, a restorative justice conversation takes place in a structured and supportive group that meets regularly, typically over several weeks and sometimes months. Participants include the perpetrator, usually referred to as the responsible party, and the victim, referred to as the affected party, a mediator, and sometimes other members of the community, including family. If the process is a diversionary program within the criminal justice system, the participants will, at least in the initial meeting, include a representative from the police department or someone from the DA's office. Participants to a restorative justice dialogue sit in a circle. In other words, they're positioned with respect to one another peacefully. The responsible and the affected party are each prompted to disclose the meaning and the consequences of that the crime had for them, and to negotiate an agreement about what the responsible party can do and should do to redress the harm done. A trained mediator facilitates this conversation, keeping time equitably and trying to ensure that the participants address each other respectfully. The restorative justice agreement the parties negotiate might include the responsible party issuing a formal apology or some other kind of public statement or engaging in community service. The responsible party might agree to complete high school or college education programs, to undertake reflective writing, to seek treatment for substance abuse or anger, or to secure employment. And overall, the process is focused on acknowledgement, apology, and change, work that the guilty party could do to acknowledge and to redress harm done, and in some way that's possible to reconcile with the victim. The task of restorative justice participants is not to consider or recommend systematic harm reduction measures or criminal justice reform. So the aggregate interests of society are important aggregates of criminal justice, but they don't explain why what the wrongdoer has done was morally wrong, when it is, even the prevalence of a certain kind of wrongdoing, even when the prevalence of a certain kind of wrongdoing makes it urgent to criminalize it. So this restorative justice conversation that I'm describing focuses instead on how the responsible party has harmed somebody else and how those harms have objectionably affected their lives. And the theory is that the responsible party's conduct has meaning for the affected persons in a way that morally calls on the responsible party for an appropriate response. Okay, so far, this has been very individualistic in the way that I'm describing the process, and it might seem quite unpromising in view of the objections to the politics of blame that I've launched earlier in my talk. And I do think there are reasons to raise these worries about restorative justice. But restorative justice is not fundamentally a philosophy of blame. It's morally serious without being moralistic, and it brings with it, I believe, a potential to achieve broader cultural and political change. And this change, this potential for broader impact, is achieved through what I call a paradigm shift in thinking about responsibility, about what it means to hold somebody morally accountable and what it is about a person that makes that person eligible for the demands of moral redress. So the paradigm shift in how restorative justice approaches responsibility can best be understood in contrast with retributive conceptions of moral accountability. So as we've seen, retributive justice takes the view that a person's responsible when she's blameworthy, when she's done something wrong and deserves a punitive response. So to hold somebody accountable through the practice of retributive justice is to blame and punish that person. And I've argued that that's a troublesome philosophy in the context of American society. So in contrast, restorative justice supposes that when a person has wronged another person, to hold that person responsible is to expect that person to recognize and redress the wrong that they've done. So holding a person responsible is something that is forward-looking, and it also is done in a collaborative way, in a collaborative process that begins with what I've described as an accounting of what happened and a willingness on the part of the wrongdoer to listen to the impact of the crime on the victim and to think about possible modes of redress. So importantly, this conversation addresses the meaning of crime for both parties. And both parties are encouraged to tell their story in the restorative justice conversation. So the restorative justice conversation is an encounter that's structured as an ethical dialogue that cultivates perspective taking, encouraging the parties to consider criminal acts in the context of relevant details about their lives and about their social experience. So the criminal wrongdoer, as well as the victim, is encouraged to tell his or her story without any commitment on the part of listeners to a punitive response. Storytelling that contextualizes wrongdoing builds empathy and understanding. And there's evidence of this, I think quite powerfully, by the testimony of participants to restorative justice dialogues. And sometimes this experience of empathy and understanding is surprising to people that participate. Also, unsurprisingly, these stories elicited imply the need for societal repair. So the profile of people caught in the criminal justice system, as I've described to you, reveal that they've suffered social disadvantage and mistreatment by the police, other people in authority, through institutions, by fellow citizens. And their stories confirm their social marginalization, vulnerability, exposure to violence, and trauma. So as one restorative justice practitioner testified, before I committed my first crime, many, many crimes were committed against me. The first time I felt human, the first time I felt seen, was in a circle. Somebody asked me, what's your story? What have you been through? How do you feel? So my takeaway point is this. We should give up on the idea that criminal conviction implies deserved suffering. We should acknowledge collective responsibility for the legal structures and the social conditions that offer promising opportunities to privileged people and a fast track to prison for those who have been most excluded from the rights and opportunities of democratic membership. In the United States, a black male without a high school diploma is 175 times more likely to go to prison than a white man with a college education. The current criminal justice crisis calls for a remedy that includes serious socioeconomic transformation and historically conscious efforts at reparative justice. So we've got to address societal injustice, including the wealth gap and other disparities between white and black that are causally connected with crime and comprise an ongoing injustice. So while restorative justice is not itself a solution to these wider social problems, it at least gives us a clearer picture of what those problems are than we get from the established criminal justice institutions and processes. And it provides some measure of healing for its participants through an honest exploration of how and why crime has happened. So the focus of my remarks has been how we should think differently about the people we punish. We should be less retributive. We should be less moralistic in our attitudes toward criminal defendants and those who've been convicted. And I think and hope that a shift in our thinking about criminal guilt would lead us to punish less and to seek alternative approaches to social problems that have all been relegated to the criminal justice system. I think we have strong reasons not only to punish less, but to change the way we understand the point of criminal justice. So thank you for listening.
Good, now it's time for Q&A. One comment, please keep your questions as short and to the point as possible. And also for the speakers too, your answers likewise. Perhaps if you keep them brief and to the point. Just one comment I would like to make. Do you know Salt Lake City has been a leader in the country in doing initiating efforts in restorative justice. Our Salt Lake current DA, Sim Gill, has been doing it for quite a while, and our former two-term mayor, Rocky Anderson, who is sitting right over here, has been a leader in restorative justice in Salt Lake for quite a while, and that's a big part of his current justice project. So we should be very proud of what our city has been doing. So questions, maybe first from the students before we get from the others.
Right, if you have a question, raise your hand, and I'm going to run the microphone to you.
First of all, thank you both for everything you've spoken about today. I think these are both awesome ways of looking at the criminal justice system and in general American society. Specifically for Ms. Kelly, I was wondering about restorative justice because I definitely agree that it is a better path to take. However, there are certain instances where there are perpetrators that need to be taken off of the streets for the safety of others, for example, in sexual assault, predation, stuff like that. So is there still an aspect of getting them off of the streets, or is it just the restorative part of it?
I mean, restorative justice isn't going to work for all, types of crimes, or maybe we should say for all people who are caught up in the criminal justice system. It requires a willingness and a certain capacity and ability to redress the wrong and to change. And some people may not be capable of that, may pose a danger to others, and may need to be incapacitated. I suspect that's a fairly small percentage of the overall prison population, and that there's a lot of work that could be done to provide alternatives to incarceration for the segment of the prison population or of those who are criminally convicted who don't represent that extremely dangerous segment of the population that has to be incapacitated because they can't be around other people. So yes, I mean, sexual assault is a difficult area. I think there's a lot of restorative justice organizations don't want to take on sexual assault cases. There's some alternatives to criminal prosecution on college campuses. I don't know how it's handled here at University of Utah. But there's some interest on some college campuses to think about a dialogical kind of alternative to criminal prosecution, even for sexual assault. But it's not going to work for everyone. You're right about that. And sometimes victims aren't willing either, even when the perpetrator is. And in those scenarios, some organizations will bring in like a surrogate victim and have the conversation and still try to come up with some kind of resolution. But it's complicated by, all of these factors, and both the capacity and the willingness of people to engage in this kind of alternative method. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Lionel, do you have any comment on that?
No.
Okay. Other questions from the students? Other questions before you go to other people? Okay, right over there.
Hi, I was just wondering, you mentioned Thomas Jefferson, and I was wondering what you think, like how he responded to in terms of like what he did for like de-justifying or like giving any attention, the proper attention to what he did or to slavery, and what he could have done differently.
Well, I mean, he couldn't have done anything differently because he, like most of the other founders, was committed to the institution of slavery. So, I mean, this is a foundational problem for white America, right? These founding figures were, it seems to me, pretty much as compromised morally as anybody could be. I mean, it's like slavers and genocidaires. I don't know how that gets dealt with. I mean, the standard way, I guess, if we can set a standard, I mean, or think of a standard being set, would be Germany after World War II. But that would require a degree of kind of transparency and fact-finding and publicity and reparation and apology that then would, like, foundationally call into question the moral standing, like how these people could be heroes. So like, in this problem, it happens in the context of American history. It happens in the context of the history of philosophy. I don't know, those wouldn't be, obviously, Kant and Hume and Jefferson, like these can't be my heroes. That would be preposterous. So I don't, like, I feel like Malcolm X said something like this later on. He's like, white America's got to, if they're morally serious, they're going to have to deal with this problem. I really don't know what to say about that. To me, I don't really see okay, I have an idea. The best way to deal with this problem going forward is to commit to making the society actually achieving, I think, black as in capital B, black social equality. Turns out I don't think that's just for black Americans as descendants of American slavery. I think that would show or be a profound indication of finally a commitment to social equality across the board, regardless of caste, gender, or whatever kinds of major sources of social inequality. It's your test case. I regard it as a case of basically moral urgency and priority. So I think that thinking about these figures in history would look very different against a backdrop where there's at least some rough approximation of black social equality versus the current situation, which just looks like it's, I don't know, not beyond doubling, tripling, quadrupling, that's the whole of American history, this kind of exclusion and inequality as a matter of policy and popular sentiment in white America that's directed against black Americans, that is, descendants of American slavery. So there's a way, but that requires, I think, a real and profound commitment to finally approximating justice with regard to this bottom caste people. If that's not going to happen, then I don't think this whole situation, the country itself, doesn't really make sense, morally speaking. So yeah, I think that's a conversation, but all I can do is kind of some version of what I'm doing, and then white America's got to figure out what it's prepared to do in dealing with this kind of problem. Just like Stephen Douglas, I'm like walking around, I'm like, I don't know about this guy said what he said, he meant it. I mean, I don't know, I feel some kind of way, I guess, when I'm walking around, but I'm also wondering, more importantly, because I don't really feel that much, but I'm like, oh, what do the students realize, the faculty realize, the administrators realize? I'm not saying it should be renamed, but I mean, the conversation should be had, it's important, because otherwise you're normalizing practices which are morally absurd. And that seems to me just more of the same and totally unacceptable going forward.
Other questions? Okay. Professor Francis,
Yes, I enjoyed both presentations.
can you speak over the microphone?
Oh, sorry. Okay, I enjoyed both presentations, but my question is the one on crime and imprisonment. And I wonder if there's much thought given to less time in prison and more, say, with ankle bracelets, more in the way of also psychiatric and other psychological programs. I mean, healthcare is uneven in prison, as we know from every disease. So I wonder if getting rid of prisons, but still finding ways of not causing the general public to be too fearful, if there are ankle bracelets or other mechanisms, and yet be still a part of society.
There has been some progress toward some greater decarceration using the methods that you referred to, including ankle bracelets. And compared to the alternative of being in prison, they seem relatively attractive. But it's not a deeper solution to the underlying social problems that are just kind of getting funneled into the criminal justice system to, deal with behavioral expressions of what we understand are larger problems. So it is important to have criminal justice reform, but I think it's also good to have that conversation in the wider context of thinking about, the social causes and collective responsibility in terms of issues of greater social justice and how to get there. Do you want to speak to that question at all?
No, I'm
No?
happy.
Yes, okay. Mayor Anderson.
Thank you. We incorporated many restorative justice programs for 8 years and enjoyed not only the amazing stories that came out of those situations where people, instead of languishing in jail or prison or going through the criminal justice revolving door, they actually reached great constructive results. How does one resolve the dilemma that's posed between not wanting to resort to punishment and retribution and yet trying to provide a powerful incentive for people to stop destructive activity, such as our drug courts accomplish? Once you get people in the system, I've seen amazing results of people graduating from drug court, going through rehab, who would not have done it had they not been brought into the system and threatened with taking another route, and that is perhaps jail or prison. I think that's a really tough dilemma. I'm wondering how you see resolution.
It is a tough dilemma. I think part of the answer that I'm trying to give is shifting the way that we think about responsibility and accountability so that we have a less punitive model of it and a more cooperative model of it. So, somebody can be held accountable in the sense that they can go through this restorative justice process with other people, figure out how to change, how to redress the harms that they've done, which are sometimes very significant. And then I think we can one thing I'm finding encouraging from what I'm learning about restorative justice organizations, and that may be happening here, is that these are organizations that aren't just sort of interested in a dialogue between this perpetrator and this victim, but they're building out to violence reduction education programs in schools. They're trying to involve community in thinking about why people might end up making some of these choices and what their needs are, so that some of those needs can be addressed. Now, as McPherson is suggesting, that we think about, some of these needs are so great that we're going to need massive social change to really address them. But I do think sort of building out to anti-violence work, to involving communities in at least talking about, and cities and people like you, frankly, to have this kind of a different lens on the problem that will be attentive to both causes and solutions that are more community-wide and not just individual. But yes, I do see the dilemma of, getting people, the benefit of these programs is premised on their having committed a crime, right? And, we should want to intervene in other ways than in the kind of ex post facto, moment vis-a-vis criminal activity. Yeah.
Some more question? Any question? Okay, right here.
I think this will be our last one.
Thank you. I enjoyed both presentations. My question is for Professor McPherson. I'm just trying to apply your intriguing perspective of caste to other groups in our nation, and wondered how you might do that. If you could just kind of speak a little bit to, for example, anti-miscegenation laws and other sorts of issues in our nation's history, and how you would understand that with respect to caste versus race, or how you might take that argument.
Oh, okay. So let me start with the first, because anti-miscegenation, well, otherwise I'll start talking about that, and then we'll start with that. So the first is, other groups, we call them, they kind of fall outside this caste system, or if one wants to try to bring them in, there's a way to do it. There's sort of intermediate caste. So, they're not going to be members of the upper caste. They can be upper caste adjacent. So that's happening with certain model minority groups. It might even turn out that have been East Asian, originally starting in the late 50s, and South Asians more recently have been having this kind of what I call white caste adjacent model minority status. But there are even certain, Africa-identified subgroups like Nigerian Americans who can attain that status. So that's what I'm saying. That doesn't really fit so well in a color caste scheme, because Nigerian Americans are still going to be identified as Africa-identified people. You need to have some other way of getting distance from that. So I think like Somali Americans are agitating for an East African identity, and so they're not really. None of these groups are really they don't really fit. And then they also don't really disrupt the fundamental caste arrangement. So it kind of it fluctuates depending on the times and the needs. So at some point, the image of Chinese Americans is extremely low, and if you look at old Hollywood movies, it's a disaster. It's a disaster. Background history is different, but they were at that point, you could say, bottom caste adjacent. Not in the bottom caste, we know what that is, but they're not, a step up from that. And the Jim Crow laws didn't really apply to them like that, but, down there. So I think the status fluctuates depending on the time and the need. And then the second question was miscegenation. That was to police the caste arrangement. That's easy, and that was about black and white. Black men, there was nothing happening on that front. That was a non-starter, punishable by death, whether, officially or not officially. On the white side, there was never that much, obviously, interest in policing miscegenation, certainly not antebellum. After slavery, yes, but antebellum, like that, didn't jeopardize the caste arrangement. In fact, say the anti-miscegenation laws were, that's only relevant after slavery, right? Because before there's not really, or there is a law, but it's widely not observed. After slavery is basically trying to police more carefully, aggressively, the fundamental caste arrangement. So you have hypodescent. Black women give birth to a white man's child. That child is slotted for status, just as it was antebellum, is just no longer slavery in the bottom caste group, identified as black. And that's not even really a function of how they look. They might not even be literally Africa identified. So miscegenation, that was never really a big deal, and that only becomes a big deal after slavery.
Yeah, I was thinking of Chinese anti-miscegenation.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know enough about how Chinese, and I don't know how strong it was. I don't know how long it lasted, so I can't speak to that. Yeah.
Professor Hawking, one quick comment, maybe? Time is running short. One.
Actually, can I say something? I can't speak to that, actually. Yes, I can speak to that. I just figured it out, I think, what's going on. So what's going on, the white caste was policing itself aggressively at that time as well. There would be a threat, because especially they weren't bottom caste, it wasn't obvious that Jim Crow laws applied to Chinese. And so there was going to be a threat of so-called miscegenation, but it's not any weird racial thing. It's just maintaining, I think, a clear, unambiguous white caste, not some sort of hybrid thing. And so I think that's what policing the boundaries of European identity in the United States was about, even during Jim Crow times, even when we're talking about those who weren't the primary targets, like Chinese. So it's part of the same thing about preserving the white caste identity as a Europe-identified caste, not some sort of hybrid thing. That's true. So it does kind of fit in it. The dynamics are different, but the fundamental structure, it just doesn't really have anything directly to do with the bottom caste, the black caste. It's more about the white caste policing itself very aggressively at that time, yeah.
Thank you both for terrific talks. I enjoyed them greatly. I just want to restrict my question to the second speaker. And the first graph you showed, I think, showed how the U.S. leads the world in, in incarceration rate. And this has been true for decades. I've seen that graph before, it's always shocking. But it begs the question of what other countries that we consider peer countries, like Western European countries, for example, where would they show up on that particular chart? Of course, I know that those countries are near the bottom.
Yes.
They have a much better way of dealing with crime than we do.
Right.
And that connects to restorative justice versus retributive justice also. I think this is connected. My question is, what are the Western European countries doing that we're not doing? What could we learn from them? My take is that we have an intensely capitalistic, individualistic political economy system, in contrast to Western European nations, which are more group-oriented, or at least more socialistic. In fact, they're often derided as being socialistic. But it seems to me that in order to address the problems that you raise, we have to have something a little bit more like some degree of socialism in this country that we do not currently have. Something along those lines that is more group-oriented and would be more encouraging of restorative justice than the punitive, retributive kind of system that we do have.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that, or?
I mean, I agree with the connection you're drawing between retributive thinking and American individualism, but it's also true that this has been the kind of liberal individualism that's so descriptive of the United States has been true for a long time, and this incarceration explosion is something from the last 30, 40 years. So even by our own lights, right, we didn't always conduct ourselves this way with this level of punitiveness. So something else has to explain it other than that fact. But you may be right that the solution would have to be a more of a genuinely democratic society, with a sense of equality. Yeah.
One quick comment before we close here and go to the reception. It's about this idea of retributive justice that Professor Kelly brought in, that jump from the deed to the doer. We see a prominent and routine example of that when we call undocumented immigrants as illegal aliens. We stamp illegality on the human being, as Shalab bin Habib famously said that no human being is illegal. It's the act that is legal or illegal, not the human being. We routinely do that. Some humans could, of course, look like aliens, you know, and of course, no human being is alien either. They're not from some other planets. You know, they're all from here. We're all humans. But some humans may look like aliens. For example, you know, Mitch McConnell or Jared Kushner or especially Mark Zuckerberg, you know, but that doesn't mean that, you know, we have any illegal aliens, you know. Anyway, so just a comment. Anyway, it was a great program, and we thank Tanner McVern, lecturer, director, Professor Michael Poppich, and Westminster College, and especially we thank here Hinckley Institute and our Nick Cockrell here for doing all this, but especially, most importantly, we thank our distinguished speakers for giving us this most wonderful forum. Thank you so much. Okay? So time now for all our questions and discussion. We can go to the reception.
And please, yeah, take food and take some to go if you so desire as well. There's plenty.